process emissions, if you will. So that is, I guess, to say, that really just wanted to start on a note that California truly is, I think, an incredible climate leader, and their contributions to the international dialogue and energy and optimism have really been hard to overstate. So we are a legitimate clean energy leader, which I mentioned, I guess I take some pains to emphasize, because some of what I'm going to point out is how you can look at our current strategy and say that it needs to be refreshed and intensified if we're going to have a better shot at hitting the target. So let's go on to look at this is the target that we've already passed. I wanted to go next to the next slide and look at the upcoming targets. These show the 2030 target in particular. That's one set in law under Senate Bill 32. So that's a 40% reduction below 1990, again, on the statewide basis. And there's lots of other sector things going on in transportation, buildings, power supply, industry that we can talk about. But so these are economy-wide numbers. All these graphs are going to have the same scale on the left, therefore, which are 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which, converting all the greenhouse gases into their carbon dioxide equivalent is the idea there, to collapse the emissions in a single measure. So that's just to remind you again on our metrics. And then after 2030, there's a bit of you can see there's a bit of, I don't want to say discordance, but there's not more than one pathway. The yellow executive order was the one Arnold Schwarzenegger put in place for an 80% reduction below 1990. And the other target is more indicative of the carbon neutrality goal that Jerry Brown put into place. So the point being, looking forward, we have to really accelerate the emission reductions to get on track, roughly doubling them from the pace, whether you're looking at the last 3 to 5 years to 10 years. Next slide, please. Another bit of background I wanted to offer, was about innovation and some of the trends we're seeing in cost. In particular, this is going to play into the arguments around transportation electrification and its attractiveness. What this shows here is, what this shows are the historical prices for battery packs, going down about 87% in real terms over the last 10, less than that, 8 years, year over year. So that's the historical rate. And, we're going to look a bit later at the solar curve. And we're going to see several of these, what have come to be called experience curves or learning curves. And they're a bit of an amalgamation of economies of scale and innovation at the, up and down the supply chain is how I would summarize it. So next slide, please, is going to be a forward-looking look at battery prices. The last graph went to 2018. This is a forward-looking one, just to show you how there's really a broad range of forecasts showing the prices continuing to come down, and that they, a broad cross section is showing this trend of continued reductions. And this is particularly important because basically the battery cost is the difference in EVs. And the cost of EVs is the batteries have been the main difference. And so based on these trends, the total cost of ownership is expected in the next year or two to, or maybe even already has crossed over the unsubsidized market advantage threshold for smaller cars, and it'll increasingly pass that first for total cost of ownership and eventually for vehicle price for everything, including full-size SUVs by 2027, according to the same source mentioned here, the ICCT, International Council on Clean Transportation, which is a highly respected group that was part of, for example, the takedown on the VW cheating emission scandal. Next slide, please. This is the example of solar photovoltaic cost changes over time. And let's go to the next one, please. We'll see another collection of several different technologies in the power sector in a graph showing how, it's generally true that technologies experience these learning curves, which is how we can be quite confident about emerging technologies in the future coming down in costs. Let's keep moving on, please, Rachel. The last bit of background is just, as I mentioned, about the energy policy simulator, and these are the specific places that we've worked, my energy policy, or energy innovation, I should say, and showing, in every case, working with local partners, for example, often the World Resources Institute, I know in Mexico, Indonesia, India, and also in Mexico, the Central Mario Molina. In Canada, the Pembina Institute, probably the premier, well, they're kind of a combination of Brookings with a bit of a more advocacy mixed in, I guess you could say, but they're quite a top line group in Canada, et cetera. And they went on to develop an Alberta version. You'll see there just to the right of it. So these models are all available at energypolicy.solutions. And if you want to, there's an online interface, a web interface that allows you to do this dialing up and down. But you can also download the model itself, which runs on Vensim, and then the files are in CSV and Excel, with Excel as a form of documentation, sort of showing the manipulation and the original sourcing. And the same is true for the California model. Next slide, please. Okay, getting into the meat of it, what I sort of wanted to show about my first meta point that while California is a legitimate climate leader, global champion, global force, it's also true that when we looked at the state strategy for getting to 2030 in the last scoping plan, and every 5 years they do these scoping plans. They're basically blueprints, if you will, and that's where they put together their strategy, which is more an assemblage of policies and measures and vision, or hopes in some cases. So when we look at that in the mirror of the model, if you will, our model, the energy policy simulator, it gets us in reach of 2030, but doesn't quite get there. So let's take a look at that in specific next. Thank you. So what this blue line shows is the expected emission trajectory when we parameterize the model to match the strategy, if you will. And we can go into oodles of detail about what that means, if you will. And there isn't just a single line. We have a range around that, but I've learned I have a tendency to overcomplicate, and it's not helpful for communication. So trying to keep an eye on the main points, but we look at different scenarios as well. But the point is that, and this is a rather optimistic, it's an optimistic reading in the sense that it basically assumes that all the policies perform as intended, with the exception of the urban planning VMT control goals, which in this case we're modeling only half the achievement of the level that was portrayed in the plan, which was like a 25% per capita reduction below 2005 by 2035. which is a real pain to translate to 2030 and not per capita, et cetera. But it's recently BMT of per person has been rising again, so it seemed just too much of a reach, even in a intentionally optimistic portrayal to, portray full achievement of the sustainable communities strategies reductions, as they're called, sort of smart growth, the urban, compact growth, more mobility options that are not driving, that sort of stuff. And the other way that this is not a absolutely optimistic representation is around carbon pricing. And so this blue line representing expected future emissions to 2030, according to the model, is in that it rises to a price of only $29 it might be $28 in 2030, almost at the price floor, just above the price floor. And one, we test some sensitivities around that, and it's an important topic for several reasons, not least of which in the 2017 strategy, the cap and trade program and the carbon price it creates are given the role of being the closer, the maker up of the difference between what all the other policies are doing and hitting the 2030 target. So it's given a preeminent role, and it made sense to study it in some more detail, particularly because the model that there aren't good commercial models. The commercial models that are available don't have good energy sector representations, is how I've heard it explained to me. And so there were some challenges for the agency, and basically the model they run, the REMI model, has energy as a fixed input, and it's not the type of more flexible representation you'd want for carbon pricing. And so there were limitations to what they had done analytically there. Next slide, please. So this is a quick survey of the policies the policy levers we turned, if you will, the policy strengthening we enacted to hit the target. This is not a strictly cost minimizing kind of thing like Jason would recognize from economics. It's more of a, I don't want to say ad hoc because it sounds sloppy, but we'll say iterative, step-by-step cost minimization, interacting more just with a sense of technological limits and looking at how other policies interact. And looking at things like, feeling like the carbon price, it only goes up to $63 in our solution, if you will, in the policy changes we implement to get there. The price goes up to $29 to $63, and that's essentially midway between the floor and the price. And that's not exactly the right price, but I will say I've heard folks in Sacramento. Well, I don't think Severin Borenstein will mind me saying, I've heard him sort of talk about what he thinks is in Sacramento politicians' minds a reasonable price ceiling that they might be comfortable reaching. And I believe I've heard him talk about levels in the $60 to $70 range, but don't quote me on that without talking to Severin, because I don't want to put incorrect words in his mouth. But the idea is that as much as if we want to get into more details, there's a lot of attractiveness in just about any modeling of carbon pricing. Its limitations are political, and so in terms of finding, and I'll tell you, just about every journalist I talked to, they were like, "Is this realistic?" So they're always trying to find the biggest political weakness to try to not undermine, but show why it wasn't serious work. So that was some of the thinking about trying to find the political, the least political resistance again, it's with a degree of subjectivity, but just trying to give you a sense of the criteria and how we landed on these policies. But to talk about the policies in specific a little bit more, I mentioned the carbon price strengthening. We also increased the renewable electricity standard from the 60% by 2030 currently to about 68%. We increased EVs from instead of the current goal of 5 million to 7.5 million roughly, meaning you're selling about 75% electric, or some might be hydrogen fuel cell theoretically, but zero emission vehicles as the state as the state policy dialogue tends to call them, referring both to full battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric. So moving on from down to the fourth row, building electrification. There's a whole bunch of state level, local level action has happened around new building requirements, such as not allowing new gas hookups. And the state has been reorienting, I would say, building policy that way, but still there's no specific target for a level of building electrification, I think it's fair to say, which is why we call it in the second column, strengthen nascent efforts. But in our solution, if you will, to hit the target, we in residential buildings, 50% of water heaters and space heaters are advanced electric heat pumps by 2030. So you're transitioning half the market to advanced electric heat pumps in the residential sector in this portfolio of policies, if you will. And then rounding out the recommendations, a couple of ideas that we introduced. One was a carbon intensity standard for heat use in industry, and the other was around a performance standard specifically targeting concrete, which is the main user of coal in the state. It's about 50% coal-fired, 20% pet coke, 5% tires, etc. So it's one of the dirtier sources. But it turns out actually WRI was already working on an idea around that, and since we didn't have the clean concrete elegant name at the time, but rounding out the recommendations, those are the 6. And if we wanted to dig in on the bar graph to the right is just, that's showing you, if you miraculously can think back to that graph where we weren't quite hitting our 2030 goal. The gap was 25 million metric tons. And so in 2030, so you'll see in the year 2030, the sum of the bars is 25 million metric tons. So what this is showing is sort of a wedge of the added reductions in each year that these policies lead to. But in the interest of not getting too bogged down in the details, I suggest we keep moving on for now. But
can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Absolutely, and by Rachel and Jason and all, if clarifying questions or further discussion are preferred, I'm open and at your service.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I might have gotten a little lost. So when you were talking about in lawmakers' minds, there might be this, $70, is that price per unit carbon cap and trade that you were talking about versus your $28 you found with this model, the simulator model?
Well, that was a good question. Thank you for letting me clarify. Our model takes price as an input. So we, some models can go both ways, set a quantity constraint and you get a price, and others, you set a price and you get a quantity outcome. So that's how ours operates. And so in the California program, in 2030, the price floor will be about $26. That's in like roughly current, dollar value terms. It's not, just for frame of reference, $2018. And the ceiling is around $101, $100.80, something like that. The price floor changes every year. The price floor increases every year by 5% plus the last year's annual inflation, and then the ceiling is set above that. I think it's $60 above. Anyway, I'm not quite sure. I have in my paper on this. I've got a 100-page paper on the initial report, and it shows, for example, the specific price scenarios we use. But we tested a range going from the floor to the ceiling, and in the solution we use as an input a price at the middle of the allowable range, which is not any sort of formal price ceiling, but was this eminent professor's intuition about what he thought would be acceptable, because the board could always, there's measures in AB 32 about unacceptable economic consequences that give a lot of discretion, that if they wanted to give out some credits, or if the program was causing some sort of troubles, they could always lighten up. So does that help, or?
Yeah, so it's a much more general thing that cost is measuring. It's not one of these specific policy things. It's kind of all of them together.
Oh, well, the cost, that's the price of carbon. So
it was the price of carbon that you were talking about. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
but it's an input that is a policy setting in our model in order to I have a policy recommendation to go with it. It's our policy, our model, as I said, I think does more to model the real policy levers and interactions that policymakers face and that follow from those choices. But there's always some bit of models are radical simplifications, and so there's always something that doesn't exactly match. But the carbon price is always going to be just the cost of the marginal ton reduced, if you will. So it's not a societal cost. So we do have measures of direct economic costs in our report, and also society. We measure social the cost of the climate benefits and the public health benefits as well. So we give a range of costs of these policies, if you will, which I'm somewhat glossing over, but it's easy to talk about in more detail. But with a carbon price, it's going to be, in the market. In this case, in the market, there's a carbon market. So if it's cheaper for a firm or a capped entity under the program to reduce, they should make the reduction. And if it's more expensive than a carbon permit to reduce, then they should just buy a permit. So that's sort of I'm not sure if I'm explaining the logic of why the carbon price is the cost of the marginal reduction from the that emerges from the market based on the sort of, if you have a climbing cost curve, and if firms are rational, they'll make all the reductions up into the point where it's more expensive to do so than buying a permit on the market, is another way maybe to try to say it again. But then that, anyway, that plays out in different ways. The way we evaluate policies is as from an economic perspective, is sort of how the PUC does, for example, from a total resource cost perspective. It's the sum of the effect on expenditures. But let's keep I don't know. So I don't know. I can keep talking about that if you want.
Oh, no, no, thank you. Thank
Yeah, okay. I'll just say another possibly helpful clarifying concept came to mind just is that since I did really gloss over the methodology, so I don't at all blame you for having some questions, but I was trying to be kind and not cruel and dragging you down. But there's a business as usual scenario, and in each sector, we can tell you, for example, in a year, there's 26 million cars and a certain number of them are going to be using gasoline, and this is their efficiency, and this is the price of gas in that year, et cetera. And the price of gas is going to change based on carbon pricing and possibly other factors. There's a variety of economic linkages. But in each year, we're going to sort of have a representation of the efficiency, the intensity of use, fuel choice for the whole system that gives us a look at the system cost, if you will, for energy, for capital, for operating expenses, et cetera. And then to measure the impact of each to the policy, we look at the cost of the system in the two different states, in the business as usual state, and then either with one policy turned on or we get a whole nother level of complication is valuing policies in a package, because you get interactions and you have to, it matters whether, what order you do the reductions in. So basically you have to do some scaling to make everything add up, because the sum of the individual policies changes in the model doesn't necessarily add up to the sum when they act together because of the system effects, the emergent effects, if you will. But okay, hopefully I've entangled that enough to, I'm just kidding. Hopefully I've disentangled that enough to give you some comfort, but yeah. Let's look at the next one, please. Right, so that was the sort of a good time for a discussion, because that was the break point before we go on to the next bit, where I wanted to talk about some things that have happened since we put out our report in January, because going back to, I think, at the foundation, some of the battery cost innovation trends we've seen, and increasing optimism on transportation electrification. There's been some developments in transportation policy since then that I think are worth taking a look at. Before, I was going to offer some thoughts on policy priorities for maximizing, clean energy opportunities and public health opportunities, as well as economic recovery. That was my outline. Let me just take a look on time. We're at, oh goodness, it's already at 1:08. I'm going over, so do we want to, just so I don't talk through the whole thing, do we want to make sure we take a break and see what questions that might have arisen at this time?
I think that might be a good idea, Chris. Yeah, why don't you, maybe we can take some questions. And if people, Rachel, do they have the option to unmute themselves?
Not yet. I can give people that option.
Yeah, why don't you do that? And if people have questions, we can just let you unmute yourself and ask Chris, since we have about 20 minutes left here.
Okay, let's see. Okay, yes, now everyone, try to jump in one at a time. You can unmute yourself and turn on your camera if you want, ask a question.
And I did create some, bespoke graphs in the next part. So if we get to them, that'll be good. Well, not this part, but should we just leave it open and keep going, and we can have people speak up if they are moved?
That sounds like a good idea. So far, no one's jumping in, or so yeah, let's keep going. And then just as you have questions, as I did, and so sorry, I setting the precedent of jumping in.
Oh, please, I'm glad you did.
There's a question there, and let's see. He put his thumbs up there. Tomas, do you have a question? You want to unmute
That
yourself?
was a thumbs up. I appreciate it. I think he
okay, I
has
see.
encouragement. Thank you.
Yeah, it
Tomas.
was just a thumbs up, like, let's keep going.
I love those. I do those in the meeting too, even when it seems like it might not be a good idea. Okay, let's keep moving. So this is some exciting news. I just learned about this in the last week or two. This Advanced Clean Cars 2 proceeding is basically the like cars and SUVs or cars and light trucks part of the market, which is really the big kahuna, of course, in California emissions. And what this shows here, this is from a recent staff presentation to the board, sort of announcing that they were going to be doing a new rulemaking under this, what they call Advanced Clean Cars proceeding. And what this shows is that they're signaling, this is not a proposal in any formal way, but what this signals to me is that, you know, the default assumption is a proposal to get to 100% ZEV sales by 2035. And the reason I say that is if you look at the right-hand side variable is the percent ZEV and PHEV sales in a particular year. So, and that's the dashed line. So what that goes up to on the right-hand side, 100 in 2035. And I've seen other documents where it's sort of, they're putting out the idea of 2030 as I think a bookend to make as they do sometime for a favored destination. Sometimes they'll consider other bookend goals, and that's another way I'm seeing them signaling a whole new round of ambition, because we have this one interesting program that's been quite instrumental in the electric vehicle market development. Actually, in Tesla's last quarter, if you notice, they were profitable. The reason was, and this wasn't the first time, it's happened several times, it was due to these zero emission vehicle market credits. And so there's a flexible mandate. It's what I think CARB has done best in developing these, you know, blowing up the idea of a dichotomy between command and control and market policies. It's more about hybridization and importing cost containment into a range of policies. And so what it does is it sets up, first of all, it's a technologically neutral standard. So any zero emission vehicle, meaning no tailpipe, you know, if it's fueled by electricity, it still has emissions that are counted, but it's not it's called zero emission vehicle mandate because initially it was really a small control measure when first named and launched in 1990, and only more recently has it become equally, or perhaps some equally a climate measure. So there's it's technologically neutral, and it creates a market for credits that are based on, essentially, if you're above the requirement for the market's average, then you are given credits that you can sell, and if you don't meet the average requirement, then you would have to buy credits. So people buy credits for Tesla because they're, you know, they're hitting 100% ZEV sales, and it's, you know, in several quarters, it's been hundreds of millions of dollars for them. Actually, I read in the last time when they announced a profit at the last quarter, their stock price didn't jump because they viewed the profits as somewhat lower grade because they involve these regulatory revenue stream, which is interesting. Okay, let's keep moving on. That was somewhat valuable because they've more than just a digression into ZEV policy, because they've also, if you go to the next one, Rachel, are, you know, standing up this approach in the truck realm. And so they just passed on June 25th this Advanced Clean Trucks rule, which is it's flexible again. You know, there's a range of requirements in 2035 or in any year, so you can't be precise about what the standard requires because it depends on the ultimate fraction of, you know, Class B versus Class 4 and all the different classes. But in 2035, the range of requirements is 55 to 75% sales. so the 59% number that you see on the screen there, that's the weighted average based on CARB's expected sales, basically averaged over the entire period that they made a forecast. So, and what this doesn't show, just because I ran out of time, but they actually clearly are on record signaling that they're going to get to 100% ZEVs in trucks by 2045 at the latest, and are signaling that they would like to go sooner. Go to the next one, please. And this shows an example of the cost outputs that you get from the model. Actually, some of these, what we have are, we don't have some of these, for example, the battery replacement costs, some of the smaller ones. But in that, what those represent are values added in sort of in post-processing, if you will, of the model results. But what this shows are direct economic effects in any given year, the sum of benefits, sum of savings and costs, added costs or new savings due to this policy modeled essentially as the introduction of ZEVs, zero emission requirement for electric vehicles. We don't have hydrogen in the model, the version of the model I'm running. They have it in a more recent one that others are running. But basically we're modeling ZEVs as electric vehicle adoption, and there's a whole host of other policies that are going to be required, I should mention, and it's going to take several, a package of policies to transform transportation on its own, I would argue. But this is modeling the effects of, as I think of it, sort of breaking the technological dependence that has resulted from a series of cascading market failures. I know Jason's going to appreciate that. And think about it this way: external effects are the bread and butter of environmental economics, right? In my mind, those would they not, the spillover effects of all the consumer choices that have led to the petroleum-based fueling system that we have now, which in effect serves as a barrier to entry for new transportation fuels, because gasoline or diesel vehicles have the advantage of this system that's been built up over time, which offers convenience. So that's the, and thank you for shaking your head. I feel good about that, Jason. And because the natural question arises, if this is such a good deal, why doesn't it arise, due to the invisible hand of the market? So it's good to think about those things. Let's keep going. So we don't, unless folks want to go back, we can, to unpack the, and let me mention, we came up with a separate report, snappy name, Clean Trucks, Big Bucks. So you can find that easy. Just Google Clean Trucks, Big Bucks if you want to see that cost curve. This is some sort of current action, if you will, in the policy arena. I would say this is a group that came out with some, the Alliance for Clean Economy, an interesting collection of NGOs and clean energy industry groups, if you will. And they have a 4-page, quite detailed and comprehensive letter that they released in July. And they sent to the governor's office and the legislative leaders, as is sort of shown on this slide here. And I think what I'd like to do is just keep, well, let's see. I guess I would say, we could say one thing they're calling for is, is pushing for a deeper target than the target in the electricity sector than the 60%, and in particular, pulling forward procurement that had been planned for later. And they don't bother themselves with saying why or justifying it. And so in terms of getting comfortable and wanting to be supportive, I had to think about why that would be a good idea, because I mean, I think kind of like a doctor wants to do no harm, an economist has to, in a historic recession, lots of pain, you need to, wouldn't want to do, I feel an obligation not to add to the economic pain. But the way I think about it is, well, first, clearly with the low interest rates, that directly, with most energy investment being very capital intensive, that low interest rates really can be a game changer. For example, I was looking at some EV charging infrastructure, which CARB had penned out at a 5% interest rate. And, you know, if you get it down to 2.5%, which some mortgages are offering now on homes, that's a difference of 20% in the cost overall on a 20-year loan. I was just assuming equal payments and no down payment, come to think of it. But just in simple terms, so that's, and also, so I also, you know, we're in a classic Keynesian time of aggregate demand shortage. And so, you know, there needs to be, the system needs, the pump needs to be primed. And so money needs to get spent. And I think my reading of the last stimulus act at the federal level would suggest that energy was among the better performers in terms of stoking macroeconomic activity and job output. So I say, let's pull some of that. And when we add on top, you know, the recent reliability challenges, it seems like a no-brainer to want to add some procurement. Another thing this letter does really well is pointing out existing incentives that and ways to speed their delivery into the bloodstream, if you will, of the economy, and also to streamline projects in order to remove hurdles. And one area they don't get too much into that I think is worth highlighting is around building electrification. And there's some interesting areas. If you could go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight this trend in technology. These are, what we're looking at here are the costs to install a new HVAC unit, heating and AC, in two different cases. Well, on the top, new construction, and in the other, replacing a burned out furnace in an existing home, a retrofit. And in the other instance, looking laterally, you know, in a single family setting, you know, detached home, in another, in like an apartment building setting. These are actual numbers from a study that this title page shows by Synapse in Palo Alto. And so just to show what this highlights is there are installed cost savings in each of these cases. Now, the caveat is that sometimes this doesn't account for the panel upgrade that you can think of as sometimes it triggers an infrastructure upgrade for the household. So, but still, when you look at this overall, there are life cycle savings in existing homes. That's what E3, the environmental, economic and energy and environmental economics Inc. has found. E3, everyone knows them as E3, the top flight consultants, California-based, has done work pointing to the life cycle savings in existing and clear savings in new, leading leading us to suggest that the next building code should look to try to require electric buildings, certainly in residential, also in commercial if possible, for new ones. Probably not going to be a lot of new commercial buildings, let's be honest, but if we could just look at the next slide, what this shows is looping back to the start where we started and the notion of learning curves. This is a study from the National Renewable Energy. This is a graph from the, two graphs from the electrification futures study that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a couple years back now. And what this shows is on the left, again, the installed cost declines expected in coming years for these air source heat pumps under different, conditions like more to less accelerated. But if there is a falling cost in every case, and then also on the right graph is improving performance in terms of efficiency. And so I didn't even factor these in the analysis. I did because I didn't feel as familiar, but pointing out, I think that in some ways the analyses you see are often quite conservative in not factoring these things, much less just keeping up with the cost changes that have happened in the last few years. See what we have next, Rachel. We're almost, yeah, I think, yeah, it's pretty much towards the end. Trying to highlight the main points here that I think the state in particular has its entrepreneurs and its innovators, its researchers and patent registrars have done a lot to advance clean technologies to the point where solar PV was the winner last year in electric generation capacity installed, and is expected to be through 2030 globally according to the IEA, International Energy Agency. We see now electric vehicles and building electrification coming into view as increasingly market ready, mature, and showing promising pathways to savings overall in terms of the system costs. And apart from the path to a zero emission technologies that electricity is increasingly offering, although decarbonizing the last bit of the electricity sector is not easy either. Last point being, well, I touched on a bit about I wanted to make sure to touch on the market failure issue and just point out also that just because, well, I think I kind of explained it around how this isn't saying it's a free lunch, it's comparing the cost of the system in two different circumstances. There are transition costs. If you look at that cost curve for the truck benefits and costs, there are net costs of some tens of millions of dollars in the early years. But ultimately, it seems we need to envision and chart the course we want, and otherwise these types of market failures that lead to, but whether people are too busy because they're dealing with other crises or there's a host of other market failures that lead to technological stasis, if you will, make this moment particularly important to seize the mantle as a pattern-setting moment, and so that's my hope. And let me conclude on that, or go to the next slide if you like that. Yeah, I think the next slide is a nice picture as well. Would have been better in my PowerPoint, but I got used to that, so hopefully it wasn't too clunky. And I'm sorry for you, Rachel, that you had to handle that somewhat tedious task. But
no worries at all. No worries. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, Chris, do you think you could enter your email maybe in the chat function? So, because we're kind of out of time here. So if any of the students have questions and they wanted to follow up with you, they might be able to email you.
Absolutely.
That would be awesome. And where are you based? Where is Energy Innovation?
San Francisco.
Okay, right on. And how is it up there with the, everything? Is it kind of coming back to light slowly, or are you still pretty shut down there?
It seems like there's been good news Bay Area wide, statewide in the last few days, and so on the pandemic front, but the smoke is bad. I mean, thank goodness we have some air filters, and but it's it's tough times.
Yeah, true. All right, well, look, please do put your email in there, Chris, and then, do it on us when all this clears up and we can get you, in person down here, and I'll follow up with you. It's really great work, and it's great to see California leading. It's a little bright spot in these dark times. So everybody, we can give, Chris a virtual round of applause here, and thanks for launching our series.
And let's, I owe you a call, so let's talk meantime, Jason.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks everybody for showing up. See most of you later.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.